It starts with the wind, a biting, freezing wind that cuts through the thickest coat. Imagine for a moment that you are 7 years old. It is the morning of 1950 in Topeka, Kansas. The sun has barely risen, and the ground is hard with frost. Your name is Linda Brown. You are holding your father's hand. His grip is tight, protective, because where you are walking is not a playground. It is not a safe suburban sidewalk. You are walking through a railroad switchyard. Look around you. Massive trains, steel giants of the industrial age, are shunting back and forth. The air smells of coal smoke and diesel. It is dangerous here. One wrong step, one slip on the icy metal tracks could be fatal. But you have to walk this way. You have to walk 6 long blocks through this danger zone just to get to a bus stop. And then you have to wait in the cold for a bus that will take you another 2 miles across town to your school. But here is the tragedy. Here is the part that doesn't make sense to a 7-year-old mind. As you walk, you pass another school, Sumner Elementary. It is right there, just 7 blocks from your house. It is a beautiful building. It has warm radiators. It has new books. It has a manicured lawn. You could walk there in 10 minutes. You wouldn't have to cross the railroad tracks. You wouldn't have to freeze. But you cannot go in. You cannot walk through those doors. You cannot sit at those desks, because the law of the land says that school is for white children only, and you are black. This was America in the 1950s, a nation that had just defeated tyranny in World War II, a nation that called itself the land of the free, was living a lie. They called it separate but equal. That was the legal term. It sounded fair, almost technical. It suggested that as long as black children had a school and white children had a school, everything was fine. But Oliver Brown, Linda's father, knew it was not fine. He was a welder, a pastor, a man of quiet dignity. And every morning, as he watched his little girl shiver on those tracks, anger began to boil inside him. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He wasn't asking for the world. He just wanted his daughter to be safe. He wanted her to be treated like a human being. One day in September, Oliver Brown walked into Sumner Elementary. He asked the principal to enroll his daughter. The principal refused. He had to. It was the law. But that refusal, that single moment of rejection, lit a fuse that would eventually explode the very foundation of American society. Oliver Brown turned around, walked out, and decided to sue the Board of Education. But this isn't just a story about a father and a daughter. Across the country, in New York City, a man named Thurgood Marshall was waiting for a fight like this. Marshall was the chief counsel for the NAACP. He was a giant of a man, tall, charismatic, with a voice that could rumble like thunder or whisper like a poet. He was the great-grandson of a slave, and he carried the weight of his ancestors in his briefcase. For years, Marshall had been playing a game of brick and mortar. He would go to court and prove that black schools had no roofs, or no toilets, or no teachers. He tried to force states to spend money to make the schools equal, but he was tired. He realized that you could build a palace for black children. You could give them gold-plated desks, but if you forced them to stay away from white children by law, you were sending a message, a poisonous message. This message was, you are not good enough. Marshall decided to change his strategy. He decided to do something radical. He wouldn't argue for better books anymore. He would argue for the soul of the Constitution. He would argue that separation itself was a crime against the human spirit. But how do you prove that in a court of law? How do you prove that a law is hurting a child's heart? Marshall turned to science. He found Dr. Kenneth Clark and his wife, Mamie Phipps Clark, two brilliant psychologists. They had designed a test, a simple, heartbreaking experiment known as the doll test. Dr. Clark traveled to segregated schools in the South. He would sit down with young African American children, some as young as 3 years old. He would place 2 dolls on the table in front of them. The dolls were identical in every way. Same hair, same clothes, same size. The only difference was skin color. One was white, one was black.
And finally, Dr. Clark would ask, "Now, show me the doll that is most like you." Dr. Clark reported that many of the children looked at the black doll and then looked down in shame. Some of them became uncontrollably upset. Some stormed out of the room. They had internalized the racism of society so deeply that at 6 years old, they already rejected themselves. When Thurgood Marshall saw these results, he knew he had his weapon. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about states' rights. It was about psychological warfare being waged on children by their own government. The case went to the Supreme Court. It was renamed Brown versus Board of Education. It wasn't just Linda Brown anymore. It was cases from South Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, all bundled into one massive confrontation. In December 1952, the arguments began. On one side stood Thurgood Marshall. On the other was John W. Davis. Davis was a legend. He was a former presidential candidate, a man who had argued more cases before the Supreme Court than almost anyone in history. He was the establishment personified. He argued that the Constitution allowed states to manage their own schools. He argued tradition. He argued that separate but equal was a settled law carved in stone. It looked like Marshall was going to lose. The Supreme Court was divided. The Chief Justice at the time, Fred Vinson, was a conservative man. He did not want to overturn 50 years of history. He did not want to rock the boat. The justices were split. If they voted then, segregation might have survived for another generation. But then, history took a sharp, unexpected turn, a twist of fate that no one saw coming. On September 8, 1953, Chief Justice Fred Vinson died of a sudden heart attack. Thurgood Marshall, upon hearing the news, reportedly said, "I hate to say this, but God really hooked us up." President Dwight Eisenhower had to appoint a new Chief Justice. He chose the governor of California, a man named Earl Warren. Eisenhower thought Warren was a moderate, a safe choice. He would later call this appointment the biggest damned fool mistake I ever made. Because Earl Warren was not a man of half measures. He was a politician, yes, but he had a conscience. When he looked at the Brown case, he didn't see a legal puzzle. He saw a moral imperative. He knew that America was fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union. How could America claim to be the beacon of freedom to the world while treating millions of its own citizens like second-class human beings? It was a hypocrisy that could not stand. But Warren had a problem. The court was still divided. He knew that a simple majority, a 5-4 vote, or even a 6-3 vote, wouldn't be enough. If the court was split, the South would ignore the ruling. They would say it was just politics. They would resist.
Warren needed a miracle. He needed unanimity. He needed a 9-0 vote. So, he went to work. He didn't just sit on the bench. He went into the chambers of the other justices. He had lunch with them. He debated with them. He compromised. He used every ounce of his political charm. He told them that this was their moment to be on the right side of history. He slowly, methodically, chipped away at their doubts. One by one, the judges changed their minds. It took months, but finally,
The day arrived. Monday, May 17th, 1954. The courtroom was packed. There was a nervous energy in the air. Thurgood Marshall sat at the counsel table, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked up at the bench. Earl Warren picked up the opinion. He began to read. He didn't use complex legal jargon. He spoke simply, so that every American, from the president to the welder in Topeka, could understand. He asked the question, does segregation of children in public schools, solely on the basis of race, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? And then he answered his own question with one word. We believe that it does. He continued reading. To separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely on the basis of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. And then came the sentence that changed the world. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The courtroom froze. Marshall waited for the dissent. He waited for the other judges to disagree, but there was no dissent. Earl Warren looked up. The decision was unanimous, 9-0. Marshall had done the impossible. He had overturned 58 years of legalized oppression. He had proven that the Constitution is not a static piece of paper, but a living promise. But the story didn't end there. A court ruling is just words on paper. Reality is harder to change. The decision unleashed a wave of fury across the South. They called it Black Monday. Politicians vowed massive resistance. Senators signed manifestos promising to defy the court. In some states, they closed down the entire public school system rather than let black children sit next to white children. 3 years later, in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 brave African-American students tried to enter Central High School. They were met by an angry mob, spitting, screaming, threatening to lynch them. President Eisenhower had to send in the 101st Airborne Division, the U.S. Army, with bayonets fixed, just to escort teenagers to geometry class. It was a long, painful road. Linda Brown, the little girl who started it all, never got to attend Sumner Elementary. By the time the schools were truly integrated, she was in junior high. The case took too long for her childhood. But her walk, that cold morning walk across the railroad tracks, paved the way for millions. Thurgood Marshall, the exhausted lawyer, went on to become the first African-American Supreme Court justice in history. He sat in the very seats where he once stood as a lawyer, guarding the Constitution he helped to save. Today, we look back at Brown versus Board of Education not just as a legal case, but as a testament to courage. It reminds us that justice is not something that is given, it is something that must be fought for. It must be demanded by fathers who want safety for their daughters, by lawyers who work until dawn, and by judges who are willing to do what is right rather than what is easy. The railroad tracks in Topeka are still there. The old school buildings still stand, but the world is different because a 7-year-old girl took a walk and forced a nation to look in the mirror. The road to true equality is still long. The work is not finished. But on that day in 1954, America took its first real step toward becoming the land of the free.